The American Surety Building is located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan, adjacent to Broadway to the west and Pine Street to the north, with Wall Street less than a block to the south. The building is adjacent to Trinity Church, Trinity's Churchyard, and the Trinity and United States Realty buildings to the west, the Equitable Building to the north, 14 Wall Street to the east, and 1 Wall Street to the south. Entrances to the New York City Subway's Wall Street Station, served by the 4 and 5 trains, are adjacent to the building. The lot covers about 15,000 square feet, 1,400 square meters, and measures 125 feet, 38 meters, on Pine Street and 123 feet, 37 meters, on Broadway. None of the sides are parallel. The original lot, prior to the building's 1920–1922 expansion, measured 84.67 by 85.33 feet, 26 by 26 meters. The American Surety Building is 23 stories tall, with a height of 338 feet, 103 meters. It was designed by Bruce Price in the Neo-Renaissance style. Upon completion, the American Surety Building was 21 stories tall with a height of either 308 or 312 feet, 94 or 95 meters. This made it New York City's second tallest building, behind the now demolished Manhattan Life Insurance Building 1 block south, which stood at 313 feet, 95 meters at the time of the American Surety Building's development in the 1890s. New buildings in New York City were starting to use steel frames, and Caisson foundation technology was still relatively new. The American Surety Building was the first New York City skyscraper to use a full steel skeleton. The American Surety Building was also one of the earliest buildings on street corners whose articulation consisted of 3 horizontal sections similar to the components of a column, namely a base, shaft, and capital. The design inspired those of other, tower, skyscrapers in the United States during the early 20th century. The facade consists of main granite with a 3-story base, a 12-story shaft, and a 6-story capital, with 2 transitional stories at the 4th and 15th floors. A 2-story penthouse is set back above the 21st floor. The Broadway and Pine Street elevations were both 7 bays wide before an expansion in 1920–1922 brought the building to 11 bays on both sides. Price said that he wanted to design a monumental structure, and as such he intended the facade to resemble a campanile with 4 pilaster faces, the 7 flutes represented by 7 rows of windows. The windows on upper stories were originally progressively recessed by 1 inch (25 mm) per story, so the 20th floor windows were recessed by 20 inches (510 mm). This allowed light to illuminate the upper stories while utilizing entasis for architectural effect. These windows were subsequently replaced with sash windows. Unlike previous buildings such as the Park Row Building, which typically only had 1 decorated facade, the American Surety Building had all of its facades decorated. The main entrance is located on Broadway and consists of a 2-story Ionic-style colonnade supporting a 7-bay wide portico. This portico was 5 bays wide prior to the expansion. The 3rd-story windows above the portico are flanked by 6 classical figures designed by J. Massey Rind, although 2 more figures were added in the expansion. At the top of the colonnade is an elaborate frieze. The Broadway facade also has an entrance to the upper floors at its southern end. On Pine Street, the lowest 2 stories are supported by 2-story piers above a granite water table, supporting an entablature that wraps around from Broadway. There is a service entrance on the east end of the Pine Street facade, and the 3rd-story windows on this facade have projecting window surrounds with connecting spandrel panels. An entablature runs above the 3rd story on Pine Street and Broadway. The facades of the intermediate stories contain slightly projecting horizontal bands. A band course runs above the 4th story on the Broadway and Pine Street facades. There are sculptures extending across the 14th and 15th stories, connecting the intermediate floors to the transitional 15th story. The top 6 stories were treated as a cap, with Corinthian-style pilasters forming a colonnade, a parapet between the 20th and 21st stories with gilded metal, and a large projecting stone cornice atop the 21st floor. The original gilded parapet and the sculptures were removed in the 1920–1922 expansion, and a cornice with anthemia was installed atop the 2-story penthouse. The southern elevation of the 20th and 21st floors, from Price's original design, remains partially visible. Contractor Charles Soysmith designed the foundation, which was a mix of grillage and caissons. Soysmith was among the first builders to use pneumatic caissons for foundations, having used them in other projects such as the Manhattan Life Insurance Building. The caissons were sunk into stone beds between 71 and 79 feet 22 and 24 meters deep, where the layer of bedrock was situated. Each caisson was 9 feet (2.7 meters) tall and made of 0.5-inch thick, 13 mm steel. A steel shaft measuring 3 by 5 feet (0.91 by 1.52 meters) in area rose from each of the caissons, and was topped by a cylinder of 6 feet (1.8 meters) in diameter by 10 feet (3.0 meters) tall. The underlying ground was drawn out from the caissons, and then filled with concrete. 13 brick piers were subsequently built around the caisson shafts. The building's internal steel structure is cantilevered over the foundation piers due to the presence of other structures nearby when the American Surety Building was erected. The steel structure was designed to be completely separate from the surrounding buildings, and thus party walls could not be used. A steel plate was placed atop the masonry tips of each pier. A grillage of transversely laid I-beams was installed above the plates. Deep plate girders were placed over the grillages, and the cantilevers extended outward from these girders to the edge of the building footprint, where they supported the columns of the superstructure. At the time of the American Surety Building's construction, there was already discussion on building a subway line under Broadway, which would become the Lexington Avenue Line, served by the 4 and 5 trains, and a building representative said in 1897 that the foundation was designed, with a view of withstanding the effect, of a subway tunnel. 32 structural columns were used in the building, which each carry between 584 and 1,280 short tons, 521 and 1,143 long tons, 530 and 1,161 t. The building utilized portal wind bracing, which could sustain winds of at least 82 miles per hour, 132 kilometers per hour. This was demonstrated during January 1896, when the building was subjected to that wind speed with minimal evidence of oscillation. Exposed steel beams were covered with 3.5-inch thick, 89 mm fireproof tile, while the floor arches were made of 10-inch thick, 250 mm firebrick. The floors themselves were made of brick arches, concrete and ash aggregate, and steel joints, covered with a marble finish. The northern and western elevations were curtain walls, as were the eastern and southern elevations above the 8th story. Between the first and 8th stories, the eastern and southern walls were load-bearing brick walls. The southern brick wall was 4 feet (1.2 meters) thick to prevent fire from spreading to the Schermerhorn building to the south. At the time of the building's construction, the thickness of a curtain wall was limited to 32 inches, 810 mm, imposing a force of 80,000 pounds per foot, 120,000 kilograms per meter on the foundation. If the walls had been load-bearing, then they would have needed to be 84 inches, 2,100 mm thick, imposing a force of 150,000 pounds per foot, 220,000 kilograms per meter on the foundation. Due to the use of non-load-bearing curtain walls, an additional 87 square feet (8.1 square meters) of usable space was provided in the width of each 20-foot (6.1 meters) bay, resulting in a profit of $2,000 per year. Foundation costs were also reduced, although the use of a steel frame cancelled out some of the cost savings, since steel was slightly costlier than masonry. The usage of both curtain and bearing walls was not common at the time of the building's construction. The American Surety Building had more than 400 rooms upon completion, accessed by 6 elevators and a spiral staircase. The elevators moved at 400 feet per minute, 120 meters per minute, which was then considered very rapid. There were 2 water tanks, one each on the 10th and 21st floors, which had a cumulative capacity of 50,000 U.S. gallons, 190,000 L, 42,000 imp gal, and supplied water to fire hoses on each floor. The 21st floor was used solely as a utility floor. The 10th floor tank was used to reduce the maximum water pressure in the American Surety Building's pipes. When the building was expanded in 1920, a 2-story penthouse was added, with 6,500 square feet (600 square meters) of restaurant space on each floor. The rental space on the 1st through 7th floors was expanded from 4,316 to 12,000 square feet, 401.0 to 1,114.8 square meters, and above the 7th floor, the rental space was expanded to 11,000 square feet, 1,000 square meters. The expanded building had 10 elevators clustered on the north side of the building, as well as 2 staircases at the northwest and southeast corners. The lobby has a black and gold coffered ceiling with a baby centaur frieze. The ground level contains a large open arcade with 30-foot tall, 9.1 meters ceilings. There was previously a banking room at street level, which contained a gold leaf ceiling supported by 4 marble pillars. This banking room was removed in a 1970s renovation and replaced with the open arcade. During the late 19th century, life insurance firms were some of the first companies to build high-profile skyscrapers. At the time of the American Surety Building's construction, life insurance companies generally had their own buildings for their offices and branch locations, to ensure that they had instilled, not only its name but also a favorable impression of its operations, in the general public. This had been a trend since 1870, with the completion of the former Equitable Life Building just north of the American Surety site. Many firms in the financial district were building to the north of Wall Street, the traditional center of commerce in the neighborhood. By 1865, the 3-block of stretch of Broadway between Liberty and Wall Streets had 7 buildings for banks or insurance companies, one of which included the Continental Insurance Company building at 100 to 102 Broadway. Fire insurance companies established buildings on Pine Street as well. The American Surety Company was one of the insurance firms located within the financial district, having been established in 1881 at 160 Broadway. The American Surety Company bought 2 lots at Broadway and Pine Street in 1893, an L-shaped lot with frontage on both streets, and another lot at the corner. The price of the latter, $282 per square foot, $3,040 per square meter, equivalent to $7,256 per square foot, $78,100 per square meter in 2018, was the largest price ever paid for a Broadway property at the time. The same year, the company announced that it wanted to build a 15 to 20-story headquarters tower, to be built on their lot measuring 100 by 85 feet, 30 by 26 meters. The company organized an architectural design competition, in which the contestants were directed to design a building to maximize the amount of space that could be rented, while still being architecturally consistent on the outside. 9 architects entered this competition, including Napoleon Lebrun, George B. Post, Carrere and Hastings, and McKim, Mead and White. A separate competition was held for the decorative figures, which Rhine won. In February 1894, the company announced that Price had been selected to build the headquarters. Price's design called for a relatively simple building with a flat roof, and took inspiration from his previous commission for 280 Broadway. This appealed to the American Surety Company, because the site had supposedly cost $1.435 million and the company planned to spend another $1.25 million on construction. The cost was still relatively high. Price had convinced the American Surety Company that all 4 facades needed to be decorated because of its high visibility. Price had conceived the building as a tower, which he saw as the only artistic solution to the problem of high design. Although the American Surety Building was not entirely freestanding, being abutted by other structures, it had decorated facades on all 4 sides. Sometime during construction, the building's plans were modified so that it would have a 21st story. Price subsequently stated that he had planned to add a 5-story pyramidal roof to his plans, similar to St. Mark's Campanile in Venice. Work on the foundations took about 40% of the total time allocated for the building's construction, and was completed by November 1894. The design for the American Surety Building's cornice, which projected 5 feet (1.5 meters) beyond the lot line, led to a lawsuit filed by John Jacob Astor, who owned the Schermerhorn Building immediately to the south and east. When Astor threatened to build a 22-story building in May 1896, shutting off the windows on these sides, the American Surety Company rented the Schermerhorn building for 99 years at an annual cost of $75,000, equivalent to $2,004,661 in 2018, which would be equivalent to paying 5% of the Schermerhorn building's $1.5 million valuation each year. The building was completed in 1896 at a cost of $1.75 million, equal to $47 million in 2018, of which 10% had been spent on underground work. The North American Trust Company was one of the building's earlier tenants, having obtained quarters at the American Surety Building by 1898. Another early tenant was the Weather Bureau, which moved from its previous quarters at the Manhattan Life Building and installed a 100-foot-tall, 30 meters steel pole. As built, there was an air shaft between the American Surety and Schermerhorn buildings. This air shaft led to a fire in 1901 that damaged the Weather Bureau's quarters. In April 1920, the American Surety Company indicated its intention to acquire the Schermerhorn building, and revealed plans for a $2.5 million annex, equivalent to $24 million in 2018, to be finished by 1921. The company then bought the Schermerhorn building outright for $1.5 million, and started work on the annex by May 1920. Herman Lee Meader supervised alterations, while Ernest R. Graham was hired as consulting architect. The work included a new L-shaped annex that widened the building by 40 feet 12 meters, the width of 4 bays, on both Pine Street and Broadway. Meader added a light shaft along the new southern elevation, but retained Price's original facade. The work also involved removing existing flooring and partitions, since the upper floors would have to be wider than the lower floors to align with the original building's walls, which receded gradually on each floor. The entrance portico on Broadway was shifted to the center of the facade. 2 figures on the 14th and 15th floors were removed, and a 2-story penthouse was added. The work was ultimately completed in 1922, although the New York Herald reported in July 1921 that the company had picked a leasing agent for the near-completed annex. During the mid-20th century, one of the larger tenants was the Bank of Tokyo, which first took space in the American Surety Building in 1952 and expanded to the building's banking room and several floors over the next decade. Irving Brodsky bought the building in 1962, just after the American Surety Company merged with Transamerica Corporation. The Thompson Realty Company took ownership of the building in 1973. When the bank's lease expired that year, it decided to sign a long-term lease and concurrently renovate the building. Kojima International was commissioned to refurbish 100 Broadway's lowest 13 stories, used by the Bank of Tokyo, for $11 million. Kojima also installed new elevators, mechanical systems, and bronze windows, as well as reconfigured the ground floor banking and commercial spaces into an open arcade. A sculpture by Isamu Noguchi, a 17-foot-long, 5.2 meters aluminum rhomboid weighing 1,600 pounds, 730 kilograms, was also placed in the lobby. This renovation was completed by 1975. The Bank of Tokyo removed the Noguchi sculpture in 1980 without telling Noguchi. During the early 1990s, the Bank of Tokyo vacated 150,000 square feet, 14,000 square meters of space it occupied at 100 Broadway, moving to 1250 First Avenue of the Americas in Midtown Manhattan. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the building as a city landmark in 1995. After the September 11 attacks in 2001 led to the collapse of the World Trade Center nearby, Borders Group opened a 35,000-square-foot, 3,300 square meters bookstore in the American Surety Building's base in 2003. The Borders store replaced its destroyed branch in the World Trade Center and was praised as one of several commercial projects that contributed to economic growth in Lower Manhattan after the September 11 attacks. Madison Capital bought 100 Broadway in late 2010, and shortly afterward, the Borders branch closed after Borders Group filed for bankruptcy. Most of the vacant retail space was ultimately occupied in 2012 by Duane Reade, a pharmacy and convenience store. TD Ameritrade occupied the remaining space in 2013, and the same year, Northwood investors bought the building for $150 million. The American Surety Building was erected at a time when buildings usually did not rise higher than 10 or 11 stories, and when skyscrapers were generally criticized. Architecture critic Russell Sturgis praised the ground-floor colonnade as a masterly adaptation of the loveliest forms of antiquity, reinforced by the pilasters on Pine Street and Broadway. When Price died in 1903, the brickbuilder described the American Surety Building as certainly the most interesting tall building in the country. Architecture critic Montgomery Schuyler said that the building design was one of the first to use the column analogy, that became popular at the beginning of the 20th century. After the 1975 modernization project, critic Ada Louise Huxtable called 100 Broadway one of those sleeper landmarks, undesignated, of which New York has so many more than anyone realizes, an outstandingly fine early skyscraper.